God pulled a fig farmer out of his orchard to terrify a kingdom. The sun was already white over Tekoa. A working man stood among low trees, blade in his cracked hand, scoring green figs. No crown, no robe, no prophet school. But God was reaching down into the dirt of Judah to pull this man out, to put 6 words in his mouth that the priests of an entire kingdom would not survive, and to deliver a warning so brutal the ground itself would one day rise up to confirm every syllable of it. This is the story of the fig farmer who terrified a kingdom. Samaria gleamed in those years. Walk its streets and you smelled roasting lamb from upper rooms, heard harps behind carved doors, watched merchants under awnings heavy with imported goods. The borders of Israel stretched wider than since Solomon. Trade routes from Egypt to Mesopotamia passed through Israelite hands. Wealth poured in faster than anyone could count. The kingdom had a strong army, a confident king named Jeroboam II, peace, and altars smoking from dawn. Prosperity was the receipt. The wealth, the victories, the unbroken peace. Surely God was signing his name to their lives. Surely he was pleased. 300 miles south, none of that reached a man named Amos. He wanted his flock and his figs in the quiet of Judean hills, the least likely messenger God could have chosen. A layman from the wrong kingdom, no title, no temple, no standing to speak to anyone. The book that carries his name opens with a strange little phrase. Amos prophesied during the days of Jeroboam king of Israel and Uzziah king of Judah, 2 years before the earthquake. Hold on to that. 2 years before the earthquake, because we are about to watch a nobody bring a golden age to its knees, and the ground is keeping count. The fig hung heavy and green between his fingers. He pressed the blade against its skin until it split. 3 days. Give it 3 days. The heat would do the rest. This was his work. Climb into the branches of the sycamore. Score each fig by hand with a small knife. The wound was what made it ripen. Below him the flock moved through dry grass. Beyond them the wilderness fell away, brown and silent toward country where he had buried more than one lion in a shallow grave. The blade, the fruit, the flock, the heat. He had asked for nothing else in his life. Then the word of God came into him, and it would not leave. Years later, when a priest demanded to know who he thought he was, Amos answered with a sentence that has echoed for nearly 3,000 years. I was no prophet, nor a prophet's son, but I was a herdsman and a dresser of sycamore figs. Do you understand the weight of that? He named his trade. The word he used for what he did to those figs is the Hebrew, balas, to pierce, to score, to cut the skin so the fruit would turn sweet. His whole living was wounding something in order to save it. And God took a man whose hands already knew how to do exactly that and sent him to do it to a nation. Scholars debate how poor he really was. The word, noked sheep dealer, is the same word used for Mesha, the wealthy king of Moab who paid tribute in 100,000 lambs. So maybe Amos was a hired hand. Maybe he was a man of modest means who ran his own small operation. It does not matter. Rich or poor, he held no religious office and answered to no prophetic guild. That is the entire point. I never asked for this, he must have thought, standing in his orchard with a blade in his hand and a fire in his chest he had not lit. Have you ever been handed a truth you never wanted? Something you saw and knew and found you could not put back down no matter how hard you tried? Amos couldn't. So he set down the fig and turned north. The orchard went silent behind him. The wealth in Samaria was real. That was never the lie. The lie was what it cost and who paid. Israel's old order, the one written into the covenant itself, had given every family its own ancestral land. Under Jeroboam's golden age, that order was being devoured. A new urban elite flush with trade money moved on the small farmers like a tide. A bad harvest alone could not survive. A payment missed, and the land that had belonged to a family for generations was gone, swallowed into the vast estates of men who already had more than they could use. The farmer didn't leave, he stayed. But now he worked his own ancestral soil as a tenant, handing over the lion's share of every harvest in rent, kept perpetually, one bad season from ruin. The protections the law had built, the gleaning left in the corners of fields, the jubilee that returned land to its families, were simply ignored. The safety net was cut down for scrap. So picture two rooms in the same kingdom on the same night. In one, a couch inlaid with carved ivory, a table of roasted lamb and veal, wine, music, the soft glow of lamps on polished stone. The book names it directly: men who lie on beds of ivory and stretch themselves out on their couches. Generations earlier, wicked King Ahab had built an entire ivory house in Samaria, and his heirs had made decadence a way of life. In the other room, a granary swept bare, a family counting what was left after the landlord's men had come, a child going to sleep hungry beneath the same sky. And here is something that should make the hair on your arms stand up. Those ivory beds are not poetry. Archaeologists have pulled the inlays out of the ground. But hold that thought. The full weight of what they found belongs at the end of this story. The people in the bright room believed their wealth was God's approval stamped on their lives, which is exactly why the warning coming for them was going to be unthinkable. A man stood in a doorway in a city he could not afford, waiting to be ruined over the price of shoes. He had borrowed to survive, everyone had, but the harvest had failed and the rent had not. Now he stood before a judge whose verdict had been bought before the man ever opened his mouth. The debt was small. That was the horror of it. The debt was smaller than a decent pair of sandals, and the man had nothing left to surrender. No grain, no land, no animal. He had only his son. The book says it twice because once was not enough to carry it. They sold the needy for a pair of sandals. What does a sentence like that mean? For one man, it means a father standing on a cold stone floor, watching strangers lead his boy away into slavery. The boy's bare feet slapping against the stone, because in that world to be barefoot was to be marked instantly and publicly as a slave. The man had a roof. Once he had land his grandfather cleared, and it was all signed away for less than the cost of the sandals on the judge's own feet. While the father stood there with his empty, calloused hands hanging at his sides, unable to do the one thing a father exists to do. There is something even darker buried in that phrase. In Israel, the handing over of a sandal was a legal act, the formal seal on the transfer of property, the gesture that made a deal binding, the same custom you find in the book of Ruth. So when Amos says they sold the needy for a pair of sandals, he is also describing the courts themselves, corrupt judges and creditors, signing human lives away with the slip of a shoe, making slavery legal, making ruin official, stamping it and filing it, and going home to dinner. The father did not get to go home to dinner. He went home to a house with one less child in it. While that father had nothing left to count across the city, other men were counting silver, and they could not wait to count more. Cool ivory under a hand, the smell of roasting meat, the endless soft noise of harps, and underneath it all, the scrape of a thumb on a scale. The merchant class had turned cheating into a craft. They kept two sets of measures. They would make the ephah small and the shekel great, shrink the basket that measured out the grain so the buyer got less, inflate the weight that measured the silver so the buyer paid more. Charge a starving man more for less and call it business. And when the wheat ran low, they swept up the chaff and the dirt and the thin unfilled grain that fell through the sieve. The refuse, the part you would feed to animals, mixed it back into the meal and sold it to the desperate at a premium. You don't have to imagine their hearts. The book hands you their actual thoughts. They sit through the holy days drumming their fingers, thinking, when will the new moon be over so we can sell grain, and the Sabbath so we can market wheat? Still an hour even. Their worship was just an interruption of their fraud. They counted the hours of God's rest, impatient for it to end, so they could get back to the scales. And in the upper rooms above them lounged the women the prophet aimed at next, the ones he called the cows of Bashan. Do not hear that the way it sounds to a modern ear. Bashan was famous for its lush pastures and its fat, prize well-fed cattle. In that world, being well-fed was a sign of wealth and security, not an insult about a body. Amos wasn't mocking their figures. He was mocking their souls. He saw fattened, idle creatures who oppress the poor and crush the needy, who lie back in luxury and command their husbands, "Bring us something to drink." Wine paid for by the extortion happening one floor below them. Blood money poured into a cup. They didn't even have to lift themselves. And every one of these people, the judges, the merchants, the women on the ivory couches, kept the festivals faithfully. They never missed a sacrifice. They were certain God was on their side. Amos stood in the middle of all of it and saw what no one around him would let themselves see. There is a particular loneliness in that, in being the one person in the room who sees clearly while everyone else has agreed not to look. The priest watched the rough stranger from the south stir up the crowds. Everything in him said, "This man is a threat." His name was Amaziah, and he was the high priest of Bethel. You should understand that from where he stood, he was the reasonable one. Bethel was not some village shrine. It was the king's own sanctuary, the religious heart of the whole kingdom, sponsored by the crown, the place where the nation's faith and the nation's throne were welded together. And here was this foreigner, this herdsman with dirt under his nails, who belonged to no school and answered to no one, standing in the king's holy place and announcing out loud that the sanctuaries would be smashed and that King Jeroboam himself would die by the sword. That is treason. That is a man with a mouth dangerous enough to crack a kingdom. Amaziah did what any guardian of the state religion would do. He sent word to the king, and the message he sent was almost a confession of how frightened he was. The land is not able to bear all his words. He is tearing the country apart with his tongue. The land cannot hold the weight of what this man keeps saying. Sit in that for a moment, because it matters. We have been cheering for Amos this whole time. But from inside the establishment, the persecution looked like duty. It looked like protecting the people. It looked to a sincere and powerful man exactly like the right thing to do. Then the floor drops out. Amaziah turns to Amos and hands him his eviction. "Go flee to the land of Judah, eat bread there and prophesy there, but never again prophesy at Bethel, for it is the king's sanctuary and a temple of the kingdom. Go earn your living somewhere else. Profit for hire. This is the king's house, and the nobody from Tekoa does not move." Instead, he speaks the words that defined him. "But I was no prophet nor a prophet's son, but I was a herdsman and a dresser of sycamore figs. But the Lord took me from following the flock, and the Lord said to me, 'Go, prophesy to my people Israel.'" Watch what that is. That is the entire transformation in a single breath. The man who wanted only his sheep, who had every reason to be afraid, who held no title that any priest would respect, refuses to be silenced because his authority never came from a temple or a paycheck in the first place. "I cannot put it down," you can almost hear him say. "God put it in me. You cannot fire a man the king never hired." And then to the priest who tried to evict the word of God, Amos delivers a personal sentence so terrible it stops the breath, that his wife would be ruined, his children would fall by the sword, his land would be parceled out to strangers, and he himself would die on unclean foreign soil. The color must have drained from Amaziah's face as he stood there in his own sanctuary, suddenly the smaller man. There is a warning hidden in that confrontation that has nothing to do with ancient Israel. We are never more dangerous than when we are most certain we are right. 2 years passed. Then the ground moved. Then God stopped answering. Before this, twice Amos had seen ruin coming in visions and had thrown himself between his nation and the judgment. A swarm of locusts to devour the land, and Amos cried out, "Forgive! How can Jacob survive? He is so small," and God relented. A fire to consume the deep, and again the herdsman begged, and again God held back. He was a shepherd to the end, standing between the flock and the predator. The third vision, there was no begging left to do. God showed him a wall built straight and true, and in his hand he held a plumb line, that ancient tool with a weight on the end that hangs perfectly vertical and never lies. The unbending standard a builder holds against a wall to see if it has gone crooked. And God lowered the plumb line into the middle of his people. Behold, I am setting a plumb line in the midst of my people Israel. I will never again pass by them. The verdict was the kind you feel in your stomach. A wall this far out of true cannot be patched. You cannot paint it. You cannot prop it. You cannot negotiate with gravity. A wall leaning this badly has to come down before it falls and kills someone. Anyone who has ever held something they love up against a true and honest standard, a marriage, a life, a faith, and watched it come up, crooked knows the exact silence that follows. The measuring is over, the wall is condemned, and then the earth confirmed. The herdsman remembered the strange little clock from the very beginning, 2 years before the earthquake. It was not a metaphor. Roughly 2 years after Amos walked north, the ground beneath that golden age convulsed. We are no longer guessing about it. Geologists estimate it at a magnitude near 8. 2, the largest earthquake yet documented on the Dead Sea Fault in the last 4,000 years. In Jerusalem, the city of David, archaeologists found a destruction layer from the middle of the 8th century BC. Collapsed walls and shattered vessels with no signs of fire, which ruled out any army and pointed straight at the shaking earth. The same mid-8th century devastation turns up at Hazor, at Lachish, at Megiddo, at Tel Dan. The terror of it burned so deep into the nation's memory that 2.5 centuries later the prophet Zechariah was still using it to describe the end of the world, telling people they would flee as they fled from the earthquake in the days of Uzziah. And those ivory beds Amos mocked? Archaeologists pulled thousands of carved ivory inlays out of the dirt of Samaria and Jerusalem, the luxury of an elite who slept on imported ivory and ate lamb and veal while the poor went hungry. The ivory traced all the way back to sub-Saharan Africa. Proof in the ground of a wealth so concentrated and so far-reaching that the herdsman had not exaggerated a single thing. But the shaking was only the preface. Within a few decades, the Assyrian army swept down and took the northern kingdom. Amos had warned of that too. The women dragged out with hooks, the last of you with fish hooks. That was not just a slaughterhouse image. The Assyrians really did lead their captives away, with iron hooks driven through their lips. So see one of them, a woman who once reclined on a couch and sent a servant down to fetch her wine, now stumbling out through a breach in Samaria's shattered wall, on a road to a land she will never come back from, a hook through her flesh, walking the very road her own servants used to walk for her, the bleating of a shepherd's protected flock on a Judean hillside, and the dead silence over an emptied, conquered Samaria. The same God watching over both, and standing over all of it, the words this whole story has been climbing toward. God speaking through the fig farmer says it plainly. I despise your feasts. Stop there. He hates their worship. I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me burnt offerings, I will not accept them. The sacrifices they were certain bought his favor. He will not even look at them. Take away from me the noise of your songs. The temple music is noise to him. And then, like a verdict and a command at once, but let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. That last phrase hides its own thunder. The word for that stream is Nachal, and Nachal is not a gentle, pretty brook. It is a wadi, a desert riverbed that lies bone dry all year and floods only when the rains come, then vanishes again into the sand. That was Israel's justice exactly. A trickle when it was convenient, gone the instant greed turned up the heat, and God demanded the impossible inversion. Not a seasonal trickle, but a flood that never ever stops. He wedded the two words together, mishpat, justice in the courts, uncorrupted and fair, and saka, righteousness, the way you actually treat the human being in front of you. Belief and behavior fused. Because worship without justice is not incomplete to God. It is offensive to him. So God reached past every priest in Samaria and every prophet in the guilds, and he pulled a man out of an orchard with a blade in his hand and no fear in his chest, because what he wanted was never the credential. It was the scarred hands and the heart that would not flinch. And the warning did not stay in 760 BC. The plumb line still hangs. No amount of religious activity has ever once bought a person out of the way they treat the powerless, and it never will. The river of justice that God wanted to flood through Israel, he still wants to flood through the world, and he still tends to send it through the most ordinary hands he can find. Maybe hands like yours. So let me leave you with the question Amos would ask if he were standing here. Where in your own life has the river of justice become just a trickle? Fair when it is convenient, dry the moment it costs you something. Sit with that one honestly. Tell me in the comments what you come up with. I read them, and the answers to this question are always the ones that stay with me. If this story moved something in you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that God still uses nobodies. And subscribe, because the next forgotten figure in Scripture we uncover together may be the one who sounds the most like you. The plumb line is still hanging. The only question left is what it finds when it drops beside your wall.